I need a gag for today's video. Walk in.
No.
Look at the camera.
No.
And say anything you want.
And then I just leave looking great.
Yeah.
Your mom.
Alright guys, so today we are back with a different kind of thing that I wanted to try out. I know I said that I was going to do some comparative videos on Lairon and Aggron and Metang and Metagross and things like that, but someone commented the other day and gave me a really good idea that maybe I should kind of do more of a role comparative kind of deal. Like, today we're actually going to be looking at Flygon versus Steelix and the roles that they play and kind of which one fits into your team more is hopefully what I'm trying to get across with this video. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Today's subjects are going to be Flygon and Steelix, and both of these Pokemon are kind of similar in the aspect that they are both ground type Pokemon. They both have ties to the dragon typing, and they both actually play a pretty big role in the Kingdom Cup depending on your team composition. One of them may be better for you than the other. Now, Flygon here is the dragon and ground type Pokemon. Such a beautiful little thing. Our best moveset, and the moveset that we're pretty much going to be taking a look at today and comparing it to Steelix's performance, is the Mudshot Earthquake Dragon Claw. In the deep dive for Flygon, I did talk about how Stone Edge does give it a better matchup percentage, but in terms of today, this is kind of the big moveset that a lot of people are probably going to be running on their Flygon, and it just makes a lot of sense to compare it up against the Dragon Tail here, since Steelix has some mainstay up against the dragons just like Flygon here. Dragon Claw being the quicker charge move to get to there, kind of lets you break some shields. Earthquake and Mudshot working in tandem to do tons of ground type damage really helps you output a ton of damage, and especially some super effective damage to some Pokemon. Now, I did run our shield percentages here just like we normally do in our deep dives, and in a 0 versus 0 you can kind of see 55.1%, not too shabby, at least it's better than half. 2 versus 0 shields at an 80.8%, 0 versus 2 at a 2.6, that's pretty freaking low, and a 2 versus 2 shields here rounding off at 47.4%. Let's actually take a quick look up against Steelix here and let's talk a little bit about it. So Steelix here is actually a steel and ground type Pokemon. Very, very interesting typing. Considering his typing, he has a ton of different resistances, and he's got so much type advantage in a lot of scenarios, it's crazy. And later on in the video, we'll talk a little bit about like what these Pokemon are really good to pair with. Steelix was an extremely difficult one to narrow down. So Steelix's moveset that we're looking at in this video alone is Dragon Tail, Earthquake, and Crunch. So if I'm not mistaken, in the deep dive for Steelix, Heavy Slam instead of Crunch does give us like a couple of more percents in terms of our matchup wins. But in this scenario, I feel like most people are going to be running Crunch. That's pretty much the most favored moveset, which I think that makes it pretty notable to look at in this video. So in our shield situations here, we do have a 0 versus 0 shield situation at 60.3, so we do edge out just a little bit better there. 2 versus 0 shields, 100%, so of course we do edge out there. 0 versus 2, 7.7%, so we do edge out there. And our 2 versus 2 ends up being a 43.6, which Flygon just barely beats us there. So I think right off the bat, in terms of like our shield usages and just based on the small bit of information that we know here, I definitely feel like Steelix is the more well-rounded Pokemon, especially when you start to look at these matchups here. You can start to see that Steelix really does end up winning more matches than Flygon, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. So let's actually take a look at some type matches. So how well do these two Pokemon do up against an entire typing? Now in all of these matchups, I did end up using a 1 versus 1 shield kind of scenario so that it gives each Pokemon an even playing field as terms of what shields they can use, and it at least gives them one chance to defend themselves before dying. pretty much. So let's actually go over the steel typing first. Flygon up against the steel typing actually has some interesting matchups. So we basically win most of them. The only ones that we end up losing to are Lucario, which is kind of not a huge surprise, but still kind of interesting considering Lucario should have some weakness to the ground. But we end up losing to Lucario in a 1v1 shield situation. Alolan Sandshrew. Yeah, Alolan Sandshrew can actually end up beating Flygon, which is kind of embarrassing. Skarmory and Scizor also end up beating the Flygon in our Steel category, so pretty respectable considering that there's quite a few Steel-type Pokemon in the Cup. We only end up losing to 4 of those, so not too shabby. On the Steelix side, we end up losing in terms of our Steel types to Alolan Dugtrio, which pretty sure just exploits the ground type weakness, Registeel, which exploits our fighting type weakness, Fortress. What? Really? Fortress gets access to Earthquake really fast considering Bug Bite, and it really just ends up putting a hurting on Steelix there. Empoleon having access to Waterfall and us being weak to water. Pretty bad. Empoleon does a ton of damage to us. And of course Lucario exploiting our fighting weakness. Yeah. We end up losing to 5 different Pokemon on the Steelix side. So, right off the bat, I mean, losing to Alolan Sandshrew is bad, but you probably aren't going to see Alolan Sandshrew, so we probably can just count that one out. I do feel like Skarmory could be in the mix, considering that people already have them. They're already basically powered up from the Boulder Cup and the Tempest Cup, so you might end up running into Skarmory. Scizor's a surprise pick, but you're definitely going to be running into Lucario. So I feel like in terms of the Steel types, I think Flygon may actually end up edging out Steelix in that regard. I feel like maybe Steelix having a resistance to Steel works out really well in his favor, but Flygon being able to output so much super effective damage to the Steel types with Mud Shot right off the bat, I definitely think that Flygon does maybe inch out Steelix a little in the Steel matchups. Now the Ice matchups here go completely different. The only Pokemon that Flygon can actually beat that carry the Ice typing are Alolan Ninetales and Alolan Sandslash. Very interesting. It's crazy that those are the only 2 that you can beat. Of course, they are exploiting our 4 times weakness to the Ice typing, so Alolan Ninetales and Alolan Sandslash definitely do end up putting a hurting on Flygon there. Now, on the Steelix side, it's a little bit more interesting because, yes, we do end up losing to several Ice types, but they're not really doing Ice-type damage to us as much as you'd think. Things like Mamoswine, Dugong, Absol, Alolan Ninetales, Lapras, and Celio all end up beating us, but each of those are kind of exploiting something different there. Mamoswine's probably going to be able to push out tons of Bulldoze damage, which ends up exploiting our ground-type weakness. Dugong, Lapras, Celio all end up being able to output Water-type damage. Abomasnow's a weird one. Even though it has access to Razor Leaf, it still ends up using Powder Snow and Blizzard to literally just take down Steelix, which is crazy. It's a crazy kind of weird thing to see after the Tempest Cup, you know, Razor Leaf. Next, moving on to our Dragon typing. So this one is kind of the toss-up between the 2. This one's where Steelix ends up really excelling, having access to Dragon Tail, and then Flygon, we've already seen in our deep dive that Flygon loses to a ton of the dragons. He is kind of the black sheep of the dragons, if you will. The only dragon that he can actually beat that's currently in the game is Vibrava. So, not looking too great for Flygon there. On the other end, for Steelix, Steelix actually beats all of the dragons except for Flygon. So, kind of interesting that Flygon actually can end up beating Steelix, but they both work similar roles. Moving on to our last typing, the Fire typing. So, Flygon really excels at the Flying typing, only losing to Charizard, which is crazy. And I'm for sure that Charizard is using Dragon Claw to end up outputting tons of super effective damage to us, which we cannot in turn push out as much to him. Now, on the Steelix side for the Fires, yeah, we end up losing to most of those. And there's not even any notable wins up against the fire types. We don't really beat anything that's super prevalent in the meta. We don't actually end up beating anything really noteworthy here. We just lose to most of the fire types, and the ones that we do win against are things that you're not going to see, like Growlithe and, you know, just weird stuff. So that leaves us with the last thing, is what should you really pair these two Pokemon with? Well, for Flygon, it's pretty clear to me that I feel like one of the best things to pair Flygon with is a Ice-type Pokemon like Lapras or Celio. Being Lapras or Celio themselves, being Ice-typing as well, they will resist a lot of Ice-type damage and be able to output Ice-type damage as well. So it ends up covering a lot of the places where Flygon is kind of weak to. Steelix, on the other hand, like I said, this one was kind of interesting to choose because it was really hard to narrow down what really helps cover Steelix. And in this cup in particular, there's not a whole lot that can cover fighting, fire, ground, and water. So it kind of just depends on what other Pokemon you have on your team. But I also feel like Kingdra, Alolan Marowak, and even Charizard could be good choices to pair with a Steelix to help cover some of his weaknesses. Kingdra will actually resist a lot of the fire damage and the water damage. Alolan Marowak will actually resist a ton of the fighting damage and some of the fire damage. And then Charizard actually resisting a lot of the fighting damage, a lot of the fire damage, but still being weak to the water type is kind of a downfall there. So depending on what other Pokemon you have on your team, which one should you go with? Well, I feel like if you already have the dragons covered, then Flygon makes a lot of sense because he's really bad up against the dragons, but he's got a ton of ground type damage to really help cover a lot of the meta, plus having access to Dragon Claw. Really, even if it's a neutral situation, even if you don't do super effective damage, it's still a great shield busting move. And a lot of the same can be said for Steelix as well, because with Dragon Tail you cover a lot of the dragons already, and with Crunch you have a lot of access to break some shields as well, with Earthquake being the hard-hitting ground type move for you. So as long as you have, you know, decent coverage, and of course, you know, the ball meta can actually also be substituted to the Sol meta. I think that is stupid, but Steelix, Altaria, Lapras, and Lucario as a core team is extremely strong as is. So being that Steelix already fits into one of the top meta teams, the top core of the meta, kind of says a lot about him as is. I mean, it's very easy to just stick Steelix in a team because he kind of molds around everybody in a really nice way. Whereas Flygon is kind of more of a wild card pick, but I still think that Flygon has a lot going for it. And I think that if you don't have any ice type damage on your team, even though ice typing is really not the greatest in this cup, I think Flygon could end up hurting you if you don't have that ice type damage. So definitely something to think about. Go back to the drawing board, look at your teams, and try to figure out, am I going to be weak to Steelix? Am I going to be covered for Steelix? Because Steelix is one of those that you're going to need to be having an out for, unless you plan on getting run over by Steelix. And if you don't have an out for Steelix, then Flygon actually makes a lot of sense as an out for Steelix, considering that he can beat Steelix in the 1v1 situation. Personally, for my team, I definitely feel like Steelix is a better fit for me. I think that the Steelix core is just so good. All those resistances, all those freaking just great moves that he has. I love Steelix as a Pokemon, just as a package. I definitely think he has a lot going for him. Flygon being a little bit more of a wild card pick, I definitely do think that it has its merits, but for my personal team, I don't think I'm going to use Flygon. That's just my team though. I'd love to know what you guys have set for your teams, and tell me, do you kind of like these types of videos? They're kind of deep dives, but they're more or less like which Pokemon is better. The versus. I don't know what I'm going to call this yet. So anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, someone has to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you there.